The first bullet shattered the diner window before Everett Maddox could lift his coffee. The second was aimed directly at waitress Lila Monroe. Without hesitation, the quiet single dad crossed 6 feet of open floor, wrapped her in his coat, and took them both behind the counter as glass rained around them. The shooters fled, but the danger had only begun. Minutes later, 12 black Mafia cars sealed every entrance to the street. Armed men stepped out, lowered their weapons, and faced Everett. Then their feared boss removed his hat and said, "You saved my daughter, now nobody touches you." It was 11:47 at night, when the rain over Greyhaven turned the windows of the Bellwether Diner into sheets of trembling silver, and inside only 5 people remained: Everett, the waitress he had come to know only as Lila the cook, working the late shift, and 2 customers gathering their coats to leave. Everett sat in the corner booth. He always chose the one with a clear line to the front door, the kitchen exit, and the parking lot beyond the glass. A habit that had nothing to do with sipping black coffee after closing his small auto shop for the night. He was 39 years old, built like a man who still trained out of instinct rather than vanity, and to anyone who did not look closely, he was simply a mechanic who kept to himself. Lila poured his coffee the way she always did. But that night her eyes kept drifting to a gray sedan parked across the street, a car that had not moved in over 20 minutes. Everett noticed the tension in her shoulders long before he noticed the car, and though he said nothing, he set his spoon down the instant the sedan's window began to lower. The first shot came a heartbeat later, tearing through the front window and shattering the coffee pot behind the counter into 100 glittering pieces. The second shot was aimed with brutal precision, not at the register, not at the door, but directly at the center of Lila's chest. Everett moved before conscious thought could catch up to his body, closing nearly 6 feet of open floor in a single motion, pulling Lila against him and dragging his jacket over her head as he threw them both behind the counter. Glass rained down around them like hail, and the wooden counter shuddered under the impact of rounds meant to end a life that had until that moment poured coffee for strangers every night without complaint. He did not panic, and he did not freeze the way most people do when the world turns into noise and fire. Instead, he counted the shots with the calm precision of a man who had counted gunfire before identifying 2 distinct weapons, a rifle and a handgun working in imperfect coordination. He guided the cook and the 2 remaining customers toward the walk-in cooler, with sharp, economical hand signals, using a metal serving tray to catch a reflection of the parking lot without exposing his own position. When the first gunman stepped through the shattered doorway, Everett disarmed him in less than 3 seconds, locking his arm and driving him to the floor with a control that spoke of training no mechanic should possess. The second gunman, seeing his partner down, dragged him back toward the sedan and fled into the rain before the first sirens could be heard in the distance. Lila stared at Everett with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, her hands still shaking as she asked how a man who fixed transmissions for a living had just moved like a soldier clearing a room. Everett offered no explanation. He simply checked her arms, her shoulders, and the side of her head for injuries. Satisfied only once he confirmed she was unharmed. Less than 7 minutes later, a low rumble of engines rose from both ends of the street at once, and 12 black vehicles, a mixture of sedans and SUVs, rolled into position and blocked every possible exit from the block. More than 20 men in dark suits stepped out in near-perfect unison, and Everett instinctively pushed Lila behind him, ready to fight a war he did not understand. But every armed man lowered his weapon the moment an older gentleman stepped out from the center vehicle, his coat unbuttoned. Despite the rain, his eyes fixed only on Lila. He crossed the broken glass without hesitation, removed his hat, and bowed his head toward the mechanic who had just saved his daughter's life. "You saved my daughter," he said, "and from this moment forward, anyone who wants to touch you will have to go through the entire Vane family first." Everett turned to Lila, and for the first time called her by the name written in files he had buried more than a decade ago. "Vane," he said quietly. "I have known that name for 12 years. Lila's face went pale beneath the flashing red and blue lights, now gathering at the edges of the street, and for a moment, she looked less like a frightened waitress, and more like a woman who had spent her entire adult life bracing for exactly this reckoning. Around them, paramedics moved through broken glass. The cook was wrapped in a blanket and questioned gently by an officer who kept glancing nervously at the 12 idling engines, and somewhere beyond that wall of black vehicles, A city that had never known Everett's real name was about to learn far more than he ever wanted it to know. 24 hours earlier, the street outside Bellwether Diner had held none of that danger, and Everett Maddox had been exactly what everyone in Greyhaven believed him to be: a tired but steady man running a modest auto shop 3 blocks from the diner where he ate most of his dinners. He lived alone above the garage in a small apartment that held almost nothing personal: no photographs on the walls, no medals, no evidence of the life he used to live. Neighbors knew him as a single father who had spent nearly 2 decades raising a daughter after losing his wife. A daughter who was now grown and living in another state, no longer part of the daily rhythm of his life. When she left for her own career, Everett filled the silence of an empty house with longer hours at the shop, telling himself it was simply devotion to his work rather than an avoidance of quiet rooms. He never spoke of his past, never displayed the marshal's badge, locked away in a drawer beneath his workbench, never mentioned the watch with a cracked face that had stopped a bullet meant for someone else, and never opened the folder marked Operation Iron Harbor. Unless he was alone, the diner had become the only place he visited with any regularity, and Lila had worked there for nearly 8 months, always taking the late shift, always vague about where she lived, always careful never to give out an address. A quiet trust had grown between them, without either acknowledging it directly. Lila setting aside a pot of coffee just for him each night, and Everett fixing the persistent rattle in her old sedan without ever mentioning payment. She had noticed the way he watched every entrance without seeming to watch anything at all, though she never asked him why. In turn, Everett had noticed things about her that did not match the profile of an ordinary waitress: the way she scanned a room for exits before she scanned it for customers, the way she refused to sit with her back to a door, and the strange stillness that crossed her face whenever a news broadcast mentioned the name Vane. On the afternoon before the shooting, Everett had been repairing her sedan when he found a small tracking device magnetized beneath the frame, and though he removed it immediately, he chose not to tell her right away. That same afternoon, Lila received an envelope with no return address, containing only a photograph of her leaving the diner, and a single typed line warning her that her father could not protect her forever. Everett urged her to take the night off, but she refused, unwilling to leave the diner short-staffed and unwilling to explain why Facey was afraid. When he pressed her further, she admitted only that someone powerful was searching for her, without revealing whether that person wanted to save her or destroy her. Everett wrote down a phone number and told her to call the moment she felt watched, then waited until she left before examining the tracker more closely. The design was unmistakable, a model he recognized from a case more than a decade old, a case that had once belonged to Operation Iron Harbor. He opened the locked drawer beneath his workbench, retrieved the old badge he had sworn he would never touch again, and dialed a number he had not used in years. Marissa Keene answered on the second ring, her voice sharpening with concern the moment she heard his. She warned him not to get involved, explaining that Silas Vane was quietly preparing to hand over evidence against his own organization to federal authorities. When Everett asked who was hunting Lila, Marissa's answer was immediate and cold. "It is not an enemy of Silas," she told him. "It is the man standing closest to him." Everett did not wait for morning. He drove straight to Bellwether Diner, but by the time he arrived, the gray sedan was already parked across the street, waiting in the rain for a target who had no idea just how carefully she was being hunted. That was the moment everything folded back into the present, back to the seconds before the first bullet shattered the glass, and Everett stepped into the diner, already sensing something was wrong. Choosing a booth with a concrete pillar shielding his left side, and studying the reflections sliding across the window glass, Lila caught the shift in his posture immediately, and he leaned close enough to speak without being overheard, telling her that when the lights went out she needed to drop and never run toward the kitchen. Less than a minute later, the first shot came, and Everett understood at once that this was not random violence, that every round fired was converging on the exact space where Lila had been standing only seconds before. He tipped over a table to create cover, hurled a fire extinguisher toward the entrance, and used its cloud of white powder to blind the shooter's line of sight, while directing the cook and remaining customers into the cooler with sharp, silent hand signals. When the first gunman pushed inside, Everett chose restraint over lethal force, disarming and pinning him to the floor in the hope of extracting information rather than ending his life outright. The second gunman fired through the shattered doorway, instead wounding his own partner before dragging him back toward the waiting sedan and vanishing into the storm. As they fled, the wounded man dropped a small metal coin stamped with the image of a raven, and Lila recognized the symbol instantly as the personal mark of a man named Preston Crow. She was forced to admit that Preston had once been the man her father trusted more than anyone else in the organization. Everett discovered a torn line across his own shoulder, where a bullet had grazed skin, only because he had turned his body at the exact right moment to shield her completely. Lila realized then that Everett had used his entire body as a wall between her and the gunfire, and she asked why a near stranger would risk his life so completely for her sake. Everett told her that 10 years earlier he had failed to protect a witness because he had hesitated for only a few seconds, and he had promised himself he would never make that mistake again. Local police arrived soon after, though Everett noted immediately that they had arrived too quickly and without the customary blare of sirens through the empty streets. A detective named Calvin Rourke moved to seize the security footage and attempted to load Lila into an unmarked car before any real investigation had begun. Everett blocked her path, demanding to see a protective order or any official paperwork justifying the transfer, and Calvin threatened to arrest him for obstruction. In the tension of that standoff, the low growl of 12 engines rolled through the street, and the convoy of black vehicles sealed both ends of the block, preventing Calvin from taking Lila anywhere at all. Rhett Danner and his security team stepped out and disarmed the suspicious men accompanying Calvin without a single shot fired, and Silas emerged to embrace his daughter, though Lila did not return the gesture. She told him plainly that she had fled the family the moment she discovered he still allowed Preston to operate through violence and fear. Silas insisted he had been secretly preparing to hand over every shred of evidence to federal investigators, hoping to dissolve the empire he had spent decades building. Everett understood that the convoy's arrival had likely saved Lila's life, but it had also made him a person of interest to every dangerous faction watching the city that night. Calvin, retreating quietly into the shadows, sent a message to Preston, confirming that the target had survived, but that a larger complication had returned to the city, a man named Everett Maddox. Silas insisted on taking Everett and Lila to a hotel, controlled entirely by the Vane family, but Everett refused to climb into any vehicle belonging to a criminal organization, no matter how grateful its leader claimed to be. Silas then revealed that Everett was no stranger to him at all, explaining that 12 years earlier during Operation Iron Harbor, Everett had commanded a small unit protecting federal witnesses when Preston secretly sold Silas's own convoy out to a rival organization. In the chaos of the resulting ambush, Everett had a clear opportunity to arrest Silas outright, yet chose instead to pull the wounded from a burning vehicle, including Silas himself. Everett countered sharply that saving a man's life did not mean forgiving the crimes that man had committed, and Silas admitted as much, confessing that he now wanted nothing more than to end the empire he had spent his life constructing. Lila carried a copy of an encrypted financial ledger containing evidence that Preston had orchestrated numerous unauthorized assassinations, that Calvin had been paid to erase official records, that dozens of shell companies were laundering tens of millions of dollars, and that Preston was actively forecast, preparing to murder Silas and frame Lila for his death. The original ledger remained hidden inside a secured vault, though only Lila knew its precise location, and Preston believed she had already handed it to Everett before the shooting occurred, which made Everett a target to be captured, rather than simply eliminated. Silas ordered the 12-vehicle convoy to escort Everett home, but Everett refused again, arguing that a Mafia procession would draw far more attention than it would ever prevent. When he finally returned to his shop alone, he found it had been thoroughly searched, and the single-family photograph he kept had been placed deliberately on his workbench beside a single unfired bullet. Everett understood immediately that Preston had investigated his past and discovered that he had once raised a daughter alone, and even though that daughter was now grown and living far away, the implied threat ignited a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. He called Silas and laid out 3 conditions before agreeing to help any further: that no one in the family would attempt to approach his own family, that Silas would surrender every piece of evidence to federal authorities, and that Everett himself would protect only Lila, never serve the organization directly. Silas accepted without hesitation, though Rhett quietly warned that somewhere inside the security detail, at least one traitor remained hidden. That warning proved accurate almost immediately, because footage from the shop's camera revealed the intruder who had searched Everett's private space was not Preston or Calvin at all, but one of the very men who had arrived that night inside the convoy of 12 cars. Everett drove Lila to an old safe house on the outskirts of the city, a location known only to himself and Marissa, and along the way, she finally asked why a man at the height of a promising federal career would walk away from it all. Everett answered honestly, telling her that he had married young, that his wife had died of illness while their daughter was still small, and that he had spent years protecting dangerous witnesses while raising a child completely alone, missing more milestones than he cared to count. During his final assignment, Preston had bribed an official to leak the location of a protected witness, and though Everett uncovered the plan in advance, his superiors refused to believe him in time. The resulting ambush claimed the witness's life and left one of his closest colleagues seriously wounded, and rather than accept responsibility for a betrayal that was never his fault, the agency quietly made Everett the scapegoat for the entire failure. He could have fought to keep his position, but it was his own daughter, then old enough to understand the cost of his absence, who finally asked her father to choose a life that was not perpetually chased by gunfire. Everett resigned, opened the auto shop, and disappeared from the world of federal law enforcement, entirely believing he had left that danger behind for good. He remembered the drive home from the agency's headquarters on his last day, the badge sitting on the passenger seat like a stranger he no longer recognized, and how his daughter had waited on the porch that evening, without asking a single question, simply wrapping her arms around him, as though she understood exactly what the silence between them meant. For years afterward, he told himself that trading a federal career for grease-stained coveralls was not a retreat but a choice, though some nights staring at the ceiling above his small apartment he wondered whether he had simply traded one kind of vigilance for another, watching customers instead of witnesses, doorways instead of safe houses. Lila realized with quiet horror that saving her life had dragged Everett straight back into the exact world he had worked so hard to escape, and she offered to leave alone rather than continue endangering him further. Everett told her the danger no longer began and ended with her protection alone, since Preston had already made a direct threat against his own family. Marissa arrived at the safe house not long after and confirmed that Everett had indeed been deliberately set up during that final assignment. Years earlier, a truth she had spent years quietly investigating without ever gathering enough evidence to bring Preston to justice. The ledger Lila carried could finally end the entire case, but she revealed that the original was not hidden inside a bank vault, as Preston assumed. It was concealed inside an antique record player kept in Silas's own study at the family estate, a detail Silas himself did not know, since Lila no longer trusted her father completely. Everett began sketching a plan to retrieve it deliberately, refusing to rely on Silas's private army, certain that the hidden traitor would alert Preston the instant any convoy began moving toward the estate. Instead, he asked Silas to send the 12 vehicles toward a decoy location, while he, Lila, and Marissa slipped into the estate through an old maintenance tunnel beneath the property. Before the plan could begin, Everett's phone rang from a number belonging to Rhett, but the voice on the line belonged to Preston himself, revealing that he had already captured Rhett and demanding Lila's surrender in exchange for the man's life. Everett recognized the trap immediately, yet Lila could not bear the thought of a man loyal to her paying with his life for her freedom, and Preston sealed the threat by sending a short video showing Rhett bound and gagged with the very record player containing the hidden ledger visible in the background behind him. Rather than react on emotion, Everett studied the video with the same discipline that had once kept witnesses alive for years, and he quickly noticed that the sound of a passing train in the background did not match the known location of the Vane estate at all. The record player shown in the footage was clearly a duplicate, a deliberate prop meant to mislead them, and further analysis placed Rhett's actual location inside a warehouse near the southern rail line instead. Marissa wanted to alert a federal tactical team immediately, but the local department remained compromised by Calvin's influence, so Everett chose to share the real plan only with Lila and Marissa, keeping Silas informed of a false version instead. According to that false plan, the 12-vehicle convoy would deliver Silas to the family estate at midnight, and true to expectations, one of Preston's surveillance drones appeared over the property within minutes, confirming that someone close to Silas was still leaking information. Everett cross-referenced communication timestamps and identified the traitor as Declan Pike, a driver assigned to the 7th vehicle. A man who had secretly been paid by Calvin to report the convoy's every movement. Silas wanted Declan executed immediately, but Everett stopped him, arguing that killing the informant would eliminate their only path toward understanding the full scope of Preston's plan. For the first time, Silas allowed the law, rather than his own instincts, to decide a traitor's fate, and under pressure, Declan confessed that Preston intended to destroy the decoy convoy using remotely detonated explosives hidden inside the vehicles themselves. Everett quickly revised the entire operation, emptying the 12 cars of any passengers, placing heat-generating dummies inside to simulate occupants, and rigging hidden cameras to live-stream the coming attack directly to Marissa's federal contacts. The instant Preston triggered the explosives, every second of the resulting evidence streamed straight into government hands, while Everett and Lila used the diversion to breach the warehouse holding Rhett. Rather than storming the building in a direct firefight, Everett manipulated the lighting, sound, and sprinkler systems to divide the guards and create confusion long enough to move unseen. Lila proved she was far from fragile, freeing a second hostage entirely on her own and jamming the exit routes to trap several of the remaining gunmen inside. They successfully rescued Rhett, but discovered that Calvin had already arrived earlier that night and taken a hard drive containing critical evidence before anyone could stop him. Rhett revealed that Preston's plan extended far beyond that single warehouse, that he intended to assassinate Silas during an upcoming public appearance, and then forge evidence framing Everett as a hired killer working for the federal government, meaning Everett had become a target not only to be eliminated but carry the blame for everything Preston had done. Within hours, an emergency broadcast aired footage lifted from the diner's security cameras branding Everett, an armed suspect connected to the Vane criminal organization, and the manipulation of that footage had been Calvin's doing from the very beginning. He had carefully edited the recording to erase every moment, showing Everett rescuing Lila, preserving only the frames in which he restrained the first gunman with brutal, practiced efficiency. Local news outlets described a former federal agent who had apparently lost control and begun working directly for organized crime, and within the hour, a citywide alert circulated Everett's face to every patrol unit in Greyhaven. He could no longer return to his shop or contact anyone close to him directly, and Lila carried a heavy guilt, knowing that her rescue had effectively destroyed the quiet life he had built for himself. Everett reminded her firmly that Preston, not her, bore full responsibility for everything unfolding around them. Marissa attempted to have the alert rescinded through official channels, but Calvin used his remaining authority to stall every request for hours on end. Silas offered to use his own influence to intimidate the officials responsible, but Everett forbade him from using criminal methods, warning that doing so would only reinforce the very narrative Calvin had constructed against him. Everett determined that clearing his name required exactly 3 pieces of evidence: the original unedited footage from the diner, the authentic financial ledger belonging to Lila, and a direct confession from either Preston or Calvin themselves. The unedited footage remained stored on a backup server inside Calvin's private security firm, and though Lila suggested using her father's extensive network to retrieve it, Everett preferred a far quieter approach instead. They arranged for Lila to contact Preston directly, offering to trade the ledger for a guarantee of Everett's safety, and Preston agreed to a meeting inside a multi-level parking structure downtown. Everett predicted correctly that Preston would never appear in person, sending Calvin in his place instead, and the entire exchange was secretly recorded from the moment it began. Cornered and desperate, Calvin admitted on tape that he had altered the security footage and personally ordered local police to capture Everett by any means necessary. When Calvin turned his weapon toward Lila in a moment of panic, Everett dropped from the level above and disarmed him instantly, though Calvin had already positioned a team of compromised officers to surround the entire structure. Everett had a clear chance to flee unnoticed, yet he chose to remain and shield Lila instead, refusing to leave her exposed to danger a second time. Rhett and the convoy of 12 vehicles arrived outside the structure, but did not engage the surrounding officers directly, instead forming a protective barrier that kept innocent civilians from wandering into the standoff exactly as Everett had instructed beforehand. Marissa arrived soon after with a genuine federal tactical unit, forcing the compromised officers to finally lower their weapons and stand down. Calvin managed to slip away through a maintenance stairwell in the confusion, though he dropped his access badge to the security server in his haste to escape. With that badge, Everett recovered the original, unaltered footage, proving beyond doubt that he had risked his own life to save Lila, rather than conspiring with any criminal organization. His reputation began to recover almost immediately as the truth spread, but Preston had used the surrounding chaos to abduct Silas himself, sending a final message, demanding that Lila bring the ledger to the Old Marlowe Theater before sunrise. The message included a video showing Silas bound helplessly on stage, while beneath him in the theater's basement rows of explosive charges had already been carefully arranged. The Marlowe Theater had once served as a private meeting place for the Vane family's most secretive dealings, its underground network of tunnels connecting directly to the city's old harbor district. Preston's demands were simple and merciless. He wanted the real ledger. He wanted Silas dead. He wanted the entire theater reduced to rubble. And he wanted every ounce of blame placed squarely on Everett's shoulders. Everett refused outright to hand over the authentic document, and Lila, instead, prepared an encrypted duplicate fitted with a hidden tracking device inside its binding. Marissa readied a full federal response team, though she could not authorize an assault until the exact placement of the explosives had been confirmed. Rhett wanted to storm the theater immediately, with the full strength of the Vane organization, but Everett warned that any direct firefight would almost certainly trigger the detonators and devastate the surrounding neighborhood, along with countless innocent lives. Instead, he devised a plan built around the very convoy that had once symbolized fear throughout the city, positioning 4 vehicles to safely evacuate nearby residents, 4 more disguised as Lila's official escort, 2 loaded with signal jamming equipment, and 2 held in reserve as an emergency extraction route for any hostages. Silas had once used those 12 vehicles purely to project power and intimidation, yet Everett had quietly transformed them into instruments of protection for people who had never asked for any of this danger. Lila insisted on entering the theater alongside Everett, certain Preston would only reveal himself in her presence, and Everett equipped her with a small emergency transmitter, coaching her briefly on how to remain calm under the barrel of a weapon. Before they crossed the threshold, Lila asked quietly whether Everett regretted ever saving her in the first place, and he told her plainly that a person does not become a mistake simply because someone cruel wishes them to disappear. She walked onto the stage carrying the false ledger, and Preston emerged flanked by Calvin, and more than 10 armed men with Silas, suspended helplessly above them by an old rigging pulley system. Preston revealed with open pride that he alone had orchestrated the ambush 12 years earlier that had cost Everett his entire career, mocking him openly for consistently choosing to save lives rather than eliminate his enemies. While Preston gloated, Everett moved silently beneath the stage floor, marking the location of each explosive charge and relaying it directly to Marissa's team outside. Lila stalled for time, pretending to consider taking her father's place at the head of the organization. And when Preston finally opened the ledger, he discovered only the counterfeit copy staring back at him. Furious, he ordered the detonator triggered immediately, but the device failed to respond, blocked entirely by the 2 signal-jamming vehicles positioned outside. Calvin, cornered and desperate, revealed that he had planted an additional mechanical detonator deep within the basement as a failsafe, and a manual countdown began ticking downward with brutal, unforgiving precision, leaving Everett only 8 minutes to save Silas and prevent the destruction of an entire city block. Everett split the remaining tasks with practiced calm, sending Lila to free Silas from the rigging above, directing Rhett to complete the evacuation of the final residents nearby, positioning Marissa to move in and subdue the remaining gunmen, and taking the basement himself to disable the mechanical detonator before it could finish its countdown. Calvin followed close behind, understanding that if the bomb failed to detonate, he would have no way left to hide the full extent of his crimes. In the cramped basement, Everett discovered a device wired with 3 separate lines, though only one could be safely severed, and years of experience diffusing threats to protect witnesses allowed him to recognize that Preston had deliberately built in a false circuit meant to deceive anyone attempting to disarm it. Calvin lunged at him in the tight dark space, and the 2 men grappled violently just inches from the ticking device. Calvin sneered that Everett had thrown away a promising career simply to become an ordinary father, and Everett answered without hesitation that protecting a family had never once been a sign of weakness. He overpowered Calvin, but chose restraint once again, refusing to kill the man who had personally destroyed his reputation only hours earlier, instead locking him inside a length of piping before returning his full attention to the countdown. Above him, on the stage, Lila successfully freed her father, but Preston blocked their path before they could escape, and for one tense moment, Silas held a weapon capable of ending Preston's life once and for all. Lila pleaded with her father not to continue the same cycle of violence that had defined their family for generations, and Silas, trembling with restrained fury, lowered the gun and chose to let the law decide Preston's fate. Instead, Preston seized that hesitation as an opportunity, raising his own weapon and aiming it directly at Lila without a moment's warning. Everett emerged from the basement at precisely that instant, shoving a heavy stage panel between them and taking the bullet meant for her squarely in his own shoulder. Rhett tackled Preston to the ground before he could fire a second shot, and with only 12 seconds remaining on the countdown, Everett's arm had gone too weak to continue, forcing him to guide Marissa through the final steps of disarming the mechanical trigger by voice alone. The device stopped with 2 seconds left on the display, and for a long moment nobody in the basement moved. Nobody breathed, as though the building itself was waiting to be told it was allowed to stand. Everett sat back against the cold concrete wall, his shoulder soaked through with blood, and listened to Marissa's voice crack with relief through the radio before the shouting above finally reached him. Boots pounding across the stage doors thrown open, the unmistakable sound of a building being reclaimed rather than destroyed. Federal agents swept in and arrested Preston Calvin and every remaining gunman inside the building, while Lila personally handed the authentic ledger over to Marissa's custody. Silas surrendered himself willingly, agreeing to testify against the criminal network he had spent decades building. Outside the theater, the 12 vehicles still blocked every entrance to the street, but that night they existed only to shield paramedics and civilians rather than to enforce fear. As Everett was finally carried out on a stretcher, every member of the Vane organization present bowed their heads in unison, not because he had become their new leader, but because he had shown them undeniably that real strength was never measured by how much fear a person could inspire in others. Silas asked quietly what Everett wanted in return for everything he had sacrificed, and Everett, glancing toward the long line of black vehicles, answered simply that he wanted a guarantee those cars would never again be used to drive anyone toward a grave. In the months that followed, Preston Crow faced a sweeping list of federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, the use of explosives with intent to cause mass casualties, bribery of law enforcement officials, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation. Calvin Rourke lost his badge entirely and was compelled to testify as a cooperating witness in exchange for a significantly reduced sentence. The complete, unedited footage from Bellwether Diner was released to the public, showing the entire city exactly what Everett had done, throwing himself directly into gunfire to shield a woman he barely knew. Every charge against him was formally dismissed, and the cabinet, overseeing the Marshal's service, publicly acknowledged that he had been wrongfully blamed for the failed operation that ended his career 12 years earlier. Marissa offered him a permanent position as a tactical consultant within the agency, but Everett declined the full-time role, choosing instead to help train new witness protection teams on a limited basis whenever needed. Silas pleaded guilty to a long list of past offenses, while simultaneously handing over assets and intelligence that helped dismantle much of what remained of his organization's criminal operations. In exchange for his extensive cooperation, he was quietly accepted into a federal protection program following the conclusion of his trial. Before leaving Greyhaven for good, Silas requested one final meeting with Everett, arriving with an offer of money, a car, and even a house, all of which Everett refused without hesitation. He asked instead that Silas establish a compensation fund for the families who had suffered because of the organization's decades of violence, and Silas agreed, calling it the very last debt the Vane family would ever owe. Lila permanently abandoned the Vane name, choosing to continue living simply as Lila Monroe, and she used a portion of her legally verified inheritance to purchase the Bellwether Diner outright. She transformed it into a place that quietly offered work and a fresh start to people trying to escape criminal environments or dangerous pasts of their own. Everett personally replaced every pane of shattered glass in the diner's front windows, and on the very wall where a bullet had once torn through the air, Lila hung a small sign that simply read, "Courage is choosing whom to protect, not whom to destroy." His auto shop reopened not long after its bay doors rolled up each morning to the same familiar smell of oil and coffee, and his grown daughter called him soon after seeing the story on the evening news, gently scolding her father for throwing himself into danger once again. Though relief carried far more weight in her voice than anger ever could, Everett admitted to her that leaving federal service had once felt like abandoning the very core of who he was, but he had finally come to understand that protecting others did not require him to live permanently at war. The bond between Everett and Lila settled into something quiet and unhurried, marked by small, steady gestures rather than grand declarations. She always kept a pot of coffee ready for him each evening, and he often lingered afterward to repair whatever small piece of equipment in the diner had broken down that week. Neither of them rushing to name whatever was slowly growing between them. Several months later, a single black sedan pulled up outside the diner, and Everett tensed instinctively out of old habit, only to relax when Rhett stepped out, dressed in an ordinary suit rather than the tactical gear of before. Rhett offered him the keys to the very last vehicle remaining from the original convoy of 12, but Everett declined the gift outright. Rhett explained that every other car in that convoy had already been sold, with the proceeds funneled directly into the compensation fund Everett had insisted upon, and that this final vehicle was instead being donated to a training academy for witness protection specialists. Everett smiled and accepted it on behalf of that academy rather than for himself. Some evenings regulars at the diner would ask Lila about the scar on Everett's shoulder, and she would simply smile and say that a good man had once decided her life was worth more than his own comfort, leaving the rest of the story exactly where it belonged between the two of them. The story closed on that same quiet street where 12 Mafia vehicles had once sealed off every possible escape, though now there were no armed men standing guard and no engines idling with threat in the air. Only Everett and Lila standing together outside the diner as the first light of morning finally broke over Greyhaven. Everett had saved Lila by placing his own body between her and a hail of bullets. But his greatest victory was never that 12 black cars had once arrived to protect him. It was that the very people who had spent years wielding power to spread fear finally chose to use that same power to repair everything they had once destroyed.